Your future in America doesn't just depend on what you did. It depends on where you did it, who prosecutes you, and how the law classifies you. Two people, one crime, one gets probation, the other gets decades behind bars. This is the hidden reality of American punishment. To understand how this happens, we need to understand how American law is structured. The United States operates under a dual sovereignty system, meaning both federal and state governments maintain separate criminal justice frameworks. Federal crimes violate United States federal law and are prosecuted in federal courts, while state crimes violate individual state statutes and are handled within state court systems. This creates a legal landscape where crossing state lines can fundamentally alter the nature and severity of charges. American criminal offenses are generally classified into three categories: infractions, misdemeanors, and felonies. Infractions typically involve fines without jail time. Misdemeanors represent mid-level offenses carrying potential jail sentences up to 1 year, usually served in county facilities. Felonies constitute the most serious category, with prison sentences exceeding 1 year served in state or federal institutions. Sentencing in the United States involves considerable variability. Federal sentencing guidelines provide structured ranges, though judges retain discretion within statutory limits. State systems vary dramatically. Some employ determinate sentencing with fixed terms, while others use indeterminate sentencing, allowing parole boards significant authority. Aggravating factors can enhance sentences substantially, while mitigating circumstances may reduce them. This complexity means that understanding American criminal consequences requires examining not just the crime itself, but the entire context surrounding it. Murder represents the unlawful killing of another human being with malice aforethought. The legal definition requires proof that the defendant caused another person's death, and did so with specific mental states ranging from intent to kill to extreme recklessness demonstrating depraved indifference to human life. American law distinguishes between murder degrees. First-degree murder involves premeditation and deliberation. The killer formed the intent to kill and had time to reflect on that decision, even if only moments. This classification carries the most severe consequences, including life imprisonment without parole in all states and capital punishment in jurisdictions that retain the death penalty. Second-degree murder lacks premeditation but involves intent to kill or intent to cause serious bodily harm resulting in death. Sentencing typically ranges from 15 years to life imprisonment, with many states requiring minimum terms of 25 years. Federal murder charges arise when killings occur on federal property, involve federal officials, or cross state lines. Federal sentencing can result in life imprisonment or death, depending on aggravating factors such as killing law enforcement officers, murder for hire schemes, or deaths occurring during other federal crimes. State variations create dramatically different outcomes. California employs sentences of 25 years to life for first-degree murder, while Texas allows for capital punishment or life without parole. Some states like Alaska have no death penalty but impose sentences of 99 years. Aggravating factors such as multiple victims, torture, or killing children can enhance sentences significantly or trigger capital eligibility in death penalty states. Consider a scenario where an individual plans and executes the killing of a business partner over a financial dispute. If this occurs in Florida, prosecutors might seek the death penalty given the state's capital punishment statute. However, if the same act occurred in Michigan, which abolished the death penalty in 1846. The maximum sentence would be life without parole. The legal outcome depends not just on the act itself, but on geography and prosecutorial discretion. Rape and sexual assault. Sexual assault encompasses a range of non-consensual sexual acts, with rape representing the most serious classification involving penetration without consent. The legal framework requires proof that sexual contact occurred without the victim's voluntary agreement, with force, threat of force, or incapacitation negating the possibility of consent. State definitions vary considerably. Some jurisdictions use the term rape, while others employ sexual assault or criminal sexual conduct with degree classifications. First-degree sexual assault or rape typically involves force, weapons, serious injury, or victims unable to consent due to age, mental incapacity, or intoxication. These charges constitute felonies carrying prison sentences ranging from 5 years to life imprisonment. Federal sexual assault charges arise in limited circumstances. Assaults on federal property involving federal employees or connected to interstate commerce through sex trafficking. Federal sentences under relevant statutes can reach life imprisonment, particularly when minors are involved or when the assault occurs during another federal crime. Sentencing ranges demonstrate substantial variation across states. In New York, first-degree rape carries 5 to 25 years, with mandatory minimum sentences in many circumstances. Texas imposes sentences between 5 and 99 years or life imprisonment for aggravated sexual assault. California employs sentences of 3, 6, or 8 years for rape, with enhancements for aggravating factors potentially adding decades. Aggravating factors significantly impact sentencing. Use of weapons, infliction of serious bodily injury, multiple victims, or child victims can double or triple base sentences. Many states impose mandatory minimum sentences ranging from 10 to 25 years when certain aggravating circumstances exist. Conversely, mitigating factors might include lack of criminal history or acceptance of responsibility, though these rarely reduce sentences substantially. Given the serious nature of these offenses, sex offender registration requirements accompany virtually all convictions, with many states imposing lifetime registration, residence restrictions, and ongoing monitoring. These collateral consequences often prove more burdensome than the incarceration itself, affecting housing, employment, and fundamental life opportunities indefinitely. Armed robbery. Armed robbery involves taking property from another person through force or intimidation while possessing a weapon. The legal definition requires proof of larceny, unlawful taking of property, combined with force or fear with the additional element of weapon possession, elevating the crime to armed robbery. This offense constitutes a serious felony in all American jurisdictions, typically classified as a violent crime, regardless of whether the weapon was actually used. The mere presence of a firearm, knife, or object that could be perceived as dangerous satisfies the armed element. Federal armed robbery charges arise when the offense targets banks, post offices, or other federal institutions, carrying sentences of up to 25 years under the federal bank robbery statute. State sentencing varies but remains consistently severe. In Illinois, armed robbery with a firearm carries mandatory minimum sentences of 6 years, with ranges extending to 30 years or more. Georgia imposes sentences between 10 and 20 years, with mandatory minimums preventing parole eligibility for substantial portions of the term. California employs sentences of 3, 4, or 6 years for basic robbery, with enhancements adding 3, 4, or 10 years depending on weapon type. Aggravating factors substantially increase sentences. If the weapon discharges during the robbery, many states add decades to the base sentence. If injuries occur, attempted murder charges may accompany the robbery charge. Multiple victims targeting elderly persons or robbery of homes rather than businesses can trigger enhanced sentencing provisions. In contrast, demonstrating that the weapon was unloaded or that minimal force was used might provide modest mitigation, though armed robbery remains a strike offense under 3 strikes laws in states employing such frameworks. A practical scenario illustrates the stakes. An individual enters a convenience store with a firearm and demands money from the register. Even if the gun is unloaded and no one is physically harmed, the crime constitutes armed robbery with sentencing likely exceeding 10 years in most jurisdictions. If the robbery crosses state lines or the store processes federal benefits, federal prosecution becomes possible, potentially resulting in even lengthier sentences under federal guidelines. Drug trafficking. Drug trafficking involves the cultivation, manufacture, distribution, or possession with intent to distribute controlled substances. Federal law and state statutes classify drugs into schedules based on abuse potential and accepted medical use, with penalties varying dramatically based on substance type and quantity. Federal drug trafficking prosecutions occur frequently given the interstate nature of drug distribution. The federal sentencing structure employs mandatory minimums tied to drug quantities. Trafficking 5 kilograms or more of cocaine triggers a 10-year mandatory minimum sentence, while 5 grams of methamphetamine actual, not mixture, carries a 5-year minimum. Marijuana trafficking, despite state-level legalization in numerous jurisdictions, remains federally prohibited with quantities of 1,000 kilograms or more, carrying 10 years to life imprisonment. State approaches vary considerably, particularly regarding marijuana. While states like Colorado and California have legalized recreational marijuana, trafficking in states like Texas or Alabama remains a serious felony. Methamphetamine and fentanyl trafficking carry severe penalties nationwide, with many states imposing sentences comparable to federal ranges. Sentencing depends heavily on quantity. Small-scale distribution might result in 5 to 10 years, while large-scale trafficking operations can lead to decades or life imprisonment. Federal sentencing guidelines calculate offense levels based on drug type and weight, with additional enhancements for role in the offense, use of weapons, or distribution near schools. Aggravating factors include prior drug convictions, which can trigger enhanced mandatory minimums. A second trafficking conviction might carry a mandatory 20 years where the first offense carried 10. Distribution to minors, trafficking near schools or playgrounds, and involvement of firearms all substantially increase sentences. However, the federal system offers significant incentives for cooperation. Providing substantial assistance to authorities in prosecuting others can result in sentences below mandatory minimums through government-sponsored departures, sometimes reducing decades-long sentences to single-digit years. Consider an individual caught transporting 50 kilograms of cocaine across state lines. Federal prosecution would be virtually certain, with sentencing guidelines suggesting 15 to 20 years before any enhancements. If a firearm was present in the vehicle, even legally possessed, additional years would be added. However, if this individual cooperated extensively with authorities, identifying suppliers and distribution networks, the sentence might be reduced to 8 or 10 years through substantial assistance provisions. Manslaughter. Manslaughter constitutes unlawful killing without malice aforethought, distinguishing it from murder. American law recognizes two primary categories: voluntary and involuntary manslaughter. Voluntary manslaughter typically involves intentional killing, occurring in the heat of passion after adequate provocation, while involuntary manslaughter results from reckless or negligent conduct, causing death without intent to kill. Voluntary manslaughter often arises when individuals discover circumstances that would cause reasonable people to lose self-control. The classic example involves finding a spouse in an act of infidelity and immediately reacting violently. The law recognizes human frailty in these circumstances, reducing murder charges to manslaughter. Federal voluntary manslaughter charges are rare, arising primarily on federal property or involving federal officials. Sentencing typically ranges from 10 to 15 years federally. State sentences for voluntary manslaughter vary significantly. California imposes 3, 6, or 11 years. New York employs sentences of 5 to 25 years, treating voluntary manslaughter as a Class B felony. Florida uses up to 15 years for standard cases, with enhancements possible based on victim characteristics or weapon use. Involuntary manslaughter encompasses deaths resulting from reckless conduct or criminal negligence. A driver racing at excessive speeds through residential areas who strikes and kills a pedestrian likely faces involuntary manslaughter charges. Similarly, leaving a loaded firearm accessible to children who accidentally discharge it, causing death, constitutes involuntary manslaughter in many jurisdictions. Federal involuntary manslaughter carries sentences up to 8 years, while state ranges typically fall between 2 and 10 years. However, when vehicles are involved, many states charge vehicular manslaughter with separate sentencing structures. Driving under the influence causing death might carry 5 to 15 years depending on the jurisdiction and prior DUI history. Aggravating factors include multiple deaths, extreme recklessness, or deaths occurring during other criminal conduct. Mitigating factors such as genuine remorse, lack of criminal history, or immediate acceptance of responsibility can reduce sentences within the applicable range. Nevertheless, manslaughter remains a serious felony with substantial incarceration periods and collateral consequences, including difficulty obtaining employment and loss of certain civil rights. Burglary. Burglary involves unlawful entry into a structure with intent to commit a crime therein. Contrary to popular understanding, burglary does not require theft. Entering a home with intent to commit assault constitutes burglary. The crime focuses on the violation of secure spaces and the potential for confrontation rather than the property taken. American law distinguishes between degrees of burglary based on the structure type and presence of occupants. First-degree or aggravated burglary typically involves entering an occupied dwelling, a home where people are present. This classification reflects the heightened danger and psychological trauma associated with home invasions. Second-degree burglary might involve unoccupied dwellings or non-residential structures like stores or warehouses. Federal burglary charges are uncommon, arising primarily when burglaries occur on federal property or involve theft of federal property. State prosecution handles the vast majority of cases. Sentencing ranges demonstrate considerable variation. California employs 2, 4, or 6 years for residential burglary, while burglary of commercial property carries 16 months to 3 years. Texas imposes 2 to 20 years for standard burglary, with sentences increasing to 5 to 99 years if the structure is a habitation. Aggravating factors substantially impact sentencing. Possession of weapons during burglary, even without use, typically triggers enhanced sentences of 3 to 10 additional years depending on weapon type. If occupants are present and threatened, burglary charges might be accompanied by assault or attempted murder charges. Breaking and entering during nighttime hours when occupants are likely sleeping and vulnerable constitutes an aggravating factor in many jurisdictions. Mitigating circumstances might include demonstrating no intent to harm persons, minimal property damage, or entering through unlocked doors rather than forced entry. However, burglary remains classified as a serious felony and often counts as a strike under three strikes legislation in states employing such frameworks. An illustrative scenario involves an individual who enters a detached garage to steal tools while homeowners sleep inside their residence. Even though the garage is separate from the living space, many jurisdictions would classify this as residential burglary given the garage's connection to the residence. Sentencing would likely range from 3 to 8 years depending on jurisdiction, criminal history, and whether tools were actually taken or the burglar was apprehended before completing the theft. Fraud and white-collar crimes. Fraud encompasses intentional deception for financial gain, including schemes like wire fraud, mail fraud, securities fraud, and identity theft. These offenses typically involve sophisticated planning and substantial financial losses, distinguishing them from street crimes while still carrying severe penalties. Federal prosecution dominates white-collar crime enforcement, given the interstate and international nature of most fraud schemes. Wire fraud, using electronic communications to execute fraudulent schemes, carries sentences up to 20 years per count. Bank fraud, securities fraud, and healthcare fraud similarly carry maximum sentences of 20 to 30 years. The federal sentencing guidelines calculate offense levels based on loss amounts, with enhancements for sophisticated schemes, number of victims, and abuse of positions of trust. Loss amount determines sentencing ranges dramatically. Fraud causing losses under $6,500 might result in probation or minimal incarceration, while losses exceeding $25 million trigger base offense levels suggesting decades of imprisonment. A fraud scheme causing $100 million in losses could result in guideline ranges suggesting 20 to 30 years before any enhancements. State fraud prosecutions typically involve smaller-scale schemes. Grand theft, identity theft, and forgery at state levels carry sentences ranging from 1 to 10 years depending on amounts involved. California employs 16 months to 3 years for basic fraud offenses, with enhancements for targeting elderly victims or involving multiple victims. New York classifies grand larceny by degree based on property value, with sentences ranging from up to 4 years for amounts over $1,000 to up to 25 years for amounts exceeding $1 million. Aggravating factors include targeting vulnerable populations like the elderly, violating positions of trust such as financial advisors defrauding clients, and causing catastrophic losses affecting numerous victims. The collapse of schemes like Bernard Madoff's Ponzi operation, which caused billions in losses, resulted in a 150-year federal sentence. Mitigating factors, such as cooperation with authorities, restitution efforts, and lack of lavish spending of stolen funds, can reduce sentences substantially. Federal cooperation agreement in complex fraud cases often reduce sentences by 50% or more. Consider a scenario involving an individual who establishes a fake investment fund, solicits investors across multiple states, and diverts funds to personal use. Losses total $10 million, affecting 50 investors. Federal prosecution would be certain, with wire fraud charges for each electronic communication, potentially stacking sentences. Base sentencing guidelines would suggest 15 to 20 years, with enhancements for number of victims potentially adding 3 to 5 years. However, if the defendant cooperated fully, identified co-conspirators, and made restitution efforts, the final sentence might be reduced to 8 to 12 years. The American criminal justice system demonstrates remarkable complexity, with outcomes determined not merely by the criminal act itself, but by jurisdiction, aggravating and mitigating factors, prosecutorial discretion, and cooperation with authorities. Identical conduct can result in probation in one state and decades of imprisonment in another. Federal prosecution versus state prosecution fundamentally alters potential sentences, with federal guidelines generally producing lengthier terms for serious offenses. Understanding these distinctions reveals a legal landscape where knowledge of consequences requires examining specific statutes, sentencing guidelines, and judicial precedents within relevant jurisdictions. The dual sovereignty system, degree classifications, mandatory minimums, and enhancement provisions create a framework where small differences in circumstances produce dramatically different outcomes. This complexity underscores the importance of competent legal representation and the reality that criminal consequences in the United States cannot be reduced to simple generalizations. This content is provided for educational and informational purposes only. Laws vary significantly by federal and state jurisdiction, change over time through legislative action and judicial interpretation, and depend heavily on specific factual circumstances. Nothing in this presentation constitutes legal advice or should be relied upon as guidance for any specific situation. Individuals facing criminal charges or seeking information about criminal law should consult qualified legal professionals licensed in their jurisdiction. Sentencing ranges, classifications, and legal definitions presented here represent general information that may not reflect current law or apply to specific cases